So, hi, Randy. It's nice to see you again.
Likewise, good to see you too, Julie.
Thank you. Yeah. And just for context, you and I know each other because I previously did some self-defense classes with you and we had to shut down because of COVID. Yeah. You and Nordic Spa were two of my cancellations. That went a little bit of a contrast there, but.
Very much. Good stuff. Well, I'm glad we could connect. And maybe, Julie, if you don't mind, for viewers that are tuning in, if you don't mind, just give a little backdrop on who you are, what you provide for a lot of people. And specifically, if you don't mind, just touching a little bit on the law enforcement side of things, how you're embedded with the OPP specifically.
Yeah. Oh, that was a question that you had asked me before. Yeah. So, well, first of all, I'm a registered psychotherapist here in Ottawa. I have a group practice here that is in Canada. So we see people in person and virtually. So many years ago, when I returned to school to essentially get the training to become a therapist and work in private practice, I did victim services, which is a on-site tragic circumstance support for fire and police services. And truthfully, I did that just to challenge myself and to see if I were to be immersed in other people's tragic circumstances, if I would be okay in the end. That was something that I, wanted to understand before I stepped in the role of supporting people in that environment. And so, yeah, that's why I did that. Because they did actually some of the training I received in that volunteer role is still some of the best training that I rely on today, even as a psychotherapist with many years experience. It was really, really good. It was up in Renfrew County, which is a very rural place, right? That's the other thing too, that I want to kind of add, because there's a whole dynamic in supporting law enforcement, first responders in rural settings. There's a whole different piece to that. So much isolation, so much depending on one another and, each other's expertise and just supporting in that isolation in and of itself and all the dynamics that go with that. And then, so my early career was working with children and youth. And I worked at the Children's Hospital here in Ottawa as a child and youth counselor for 6 years and worked on the mental health floor. So that's crisis stabilization, medication management. There's a lot of, complexity to that. And then with COVID, around that same time, and speaking of OPP, Ontario Provincial Police, they had recreated program for their officers to better support their mental health and their wellness. It's known as Encompass Wellness. And so it's my understanding when I had conversations with them in 2020, they ended up doing a soft launch of this program because of COVID. So it is a provincial Ontario-based program that allows them to access mental health services. And it is, as my understanding, is a byproduct of the many suicides that unfortunately affected their members over many years, and a call to action to really address, look at and address. I know there were committees and obviously meetings, and this was the end product, and the end result was this access to unlimited mental health services through this brand, Encompass Wellness. So for me as a clinician, because I had my prior experience working with first responders, and quite honestly, I would, sit back again in my rural community. At that point, I had attained my career, credentials, and also specifically some very specialized trauma training. And I would actually be really pissed off every time I saw the ticker when there was another officer that had taken their life that we knew about, because they all didn't make the news, right? And I'm literally sitting here, I've been to Killaloe, Ontario. I don't know how many of your members or people that maybe know where that is, but it's up there. There's a little detachment there. And so, I'm seeing this and I'm like, I'm literally sitting here and I can provide this service. What is happening? So when I heard of Encompass Wellness, I reached out to them and started to take clients, referrals from them. And I haven't looked back since then. So I support OPP, I support Ottawa Police, various, individuals who work in fire, paramedics, and military. There was a time where I was seeing the children of military vets in the Veterans Affairs rehab program. And I do see adults as well in that program. And also healthcare professionals, these really underserviced areas that require a specialized kind of nuanced care in terms of just like understanding as a first responder how to like hold the space for someone who comes into a session with a therapist like myself. And I'm going to tie that directly into that video that I saw on Instagram that had me reach out to you, which was the one on September 12th. And are you recalling the one that I'm talking about, Randy, where you didn't even know that he was filming and you were talking to whoever you were teaching that day?
Yeah, I do. I know what you're talking about. So I provided a 2-day vehicle combatives course for law enforcement professionals. And there was a day that we dedicated on the mat, and then there was a day that we dedicated on the range. And specifically that video that you saw, what to give you context, what was happening was we had these interactive moving robot targets for the guys to shoot at. So they would fight in and around vehicles. They would employ their firearms, tactically to isolate these robot targets. And then the backstop, what I had done is set up a couple of no-shoot targets. So they were stationary paper targets that were, realistic looking targets that were designed not to be shot. Mm-hmm. So, kids, women, innocent bystanders, that would be, a consideration in a real-time scenario. Mm-hmm. So what was happening is guys were kind of getting over fixated on hitting the robots without a consideration of the backstop and beyond. And there was a couple of situations where bullets were striking these stationary targets. So I brought all the guys in just to highlight a point that it's difficult what we do. It's difficult to not only pull the trigger, but it's also difficult to consider the shot placement going where we don't want it to go. So there's consequence to every action that we take. And I really just wanted to highlight the point of how important it is to be cognizant before we release a shot. Are we confident that it's going to go where it needs to go? And then are we even aware of what's in the backstop and beyond? So that was the context. What I didn't know at the time was the direct action social media manager, who is, he always floats around while I'm doing what I'm doing, and he captures things like that. So it was authentic, it was real, and it was not, definitely not scripted.
So, and I just get like goosebumps because for me, when I saw it, and I didn't think it was scripted at all, it was so genuine. And I just kind of, obviously I know you're familiar to me. And so when I saw that video, I immediately like grabbed a piece of it because I was like, holy shit, because the ones who do miss the shots, or the ones who make the shots that do kill, whether it was intended or not, they sometimes end up being the individuals that come into the space, the therapy space, to process the overwhelm that is the impact of that. And so I felt like, holy shit, Randy's talking my language in a different way. And I didn't know that earlier story about, no shoot targets and how there was kind of this like, I don't know, I was going to say boys will be boys. Maybe there's girls there too, but like, I think there's a certain intensity, there's a certain vibration, like excitability, all that kind of stuff. And there's a certain level of training that when a camaraderie, when everybody gets together, and you brought the seriousness into the room, and I wanted to bring it to another level in the sense that I know there's a tremendous stigma attached, not all, but there's still a tremendous stigma attached to seeking out support for a psychological or emotional injury, essentially. And so when you said that, I was like, I loved that in the training environment, you were taking a moment to really just like say, hang on a second. And I just wanted to offer up in part of the conversation, the other part of it and I would, whether you had 10 people there, 100 people, I don't know, but I would challenge everybody there to think about who comes to mind for you that has been impacted by a stray bullet that wasn't going where it was intended to go. Because whether they know them personally or by, connection with someone else, they've all heard the stories, right? And some of them may lean into the conversation, others may pull away, right? And internalize and sort of judge and all that other, which is fine. I'm not here to call people out on that. I just wanted to have that real conversation about the fact that your colleagues, your comrades, your peers, your friends are affected. And that's the space that we hold as qualified therapists. Yeah.
And I really appreciate the fact that you reached out, not only, because yes, we have a rapport, we've known each other from the past. It was nice to obviously hear from you. But from the professional side, you're a clinician, you spend years dedicating education to your craft to be a professional that you are. And when I train, I get the opportunity and the great fortune to provide training for military law enforcement. I'm willing to believe that you'll get the feedback to support it. But I put a lot of thought and effort into not just the way that the training is delivered, but why are we doing what we're doing, and the importance of tapping into not only the tactical and the technical pieces, which are important, but also the physical, mental, and emotional pieces that sometimes get overlooked or paid lip service to during training. So the reason I say that is because we have to really, in somebody that is in the profession of arms, so law enforcement, military, there is an element of seriousness, or there's an element of why are we doing what we're doing. And we cannot have, for an example, we cannot have somebody who chooses to be a soldier or a law enforcement professional wearing a uniform, looking the part, walking and talking the part, but not believing in the why you're doing what you're doing. Because yes, there may only be 1% opportunity or chance while we're in uniform to actually pull the trigger and take the life of somebody who deserves it. But that 1% can be so impactful. And if that happens early in your career, that could have a detrimental effect in the future if we are not aware of it. So the reason I say that is important that we have a conversation with ourselves before we choose that line of work, and literally ask yourself, look yourself in the mirror and say, if the day presents itself, do I have what it takes to actually pull the trigger and take somebody's life? And if that answer is no, I would strongly encourage that individual pick a different line of work.
Right.
That being said.
Yeah. Because if they go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit, just based on, I think it's coming from your experience, but because I think I know where you're going when you say very humbly, pick another profession. The impact of that, like you're stating at the beginning of the career, is so influential on them as a human being, right? That's what you're saying. And then consequently, again, their comrades and whoever they're out in the line of duty with, there becomes a safety issue as well. That's a whole other conversation, right? So I guess maybe if I just bring it back specifically to, for you, what is it about that piece that has you asking them to seriously consider that for themselves?
Well, I think it has to do with working in a team environment. There is somebody that's depending on us, depending on me. So when I'm working in my previous place of employment, doing that job with the, high stress, high consequence circumstance of the environment, I know that the person to my left and the person to my right, they're relying on me to make a wise decision. And additionally, I'm hoping or relying or trusting that person to my left and right are also going to do what they can do with the information that they have, making the most viable option or decision in that moment. Now, all of us, we're human. We are going to make mistakes from time to time, and we're trying to minimize how many mistakes we make. And we're also trying to mitigate the weight or the level of consequences to that mistake through good training and through a deeper understanding of what it takes to make a wise decision in a split second. The reason I say that is it's okay to make mistakes as long as we learn from it. It's not okay to hope that a situation isn't going to present itself, because to me, that is that's what separates an amateur from a professional.
Mm-hmm.
A professional wholeheartedly will engulf themselves, embed themselves into everything they can be the best police officer, the best soldier that they can.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don a uniform and hope that a situation doesn't present itself, or hope that a very stressful situation is just going to go away, to me, you're in the wrong line of work. That, and I mean that in the most genuine sense. Like,
sure. Mm-hmm.
I, for example, I know my personality. I would not be a good grade school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I know my level of patience and how I interact with children. I would not be a good teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So I chose not to go down that road.
Mm-hmm.
I, am 100% respectful for anyone that goes into a teacher role.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I'm using that as an example. So for somebody to go into military or law enforcement and they're like, I probably won't have to kill anybody or pull the trigger and shoot my gun. Well, be careful with that, because
mm-hmm.
when that situation presents itself, do you have what it takes?
Mm-hmm.
That would be the question that I would ask. And how I would elaborate on that is that, sure, like I teach self-defense, and, I dedicate all my passion and everything to be the best practitioner I possibly can. But to be in reality, I hope that I don't have to use it,
mm-hmm.
but I'm prepared to if that situation falls onto my doorstep. Mm-hmm. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of jump in, and I know that you had some other thoughts there, but I just want to, like, that part of you that says, ask yourself, do you have what it takes? Do your due diligence, ask the questions, do your research, communicate with people, et cetera, et cetera. Is this the job you want to do? Because these are, like you said, high stress, high consequences, in most of the roles that you would be speaking of. And I think for someone like myself, and I sort of touched on a minute ago, just that under service, but nuanced care of working with first responders and military. So for us as therapists, we need to also be asking ourselves, do I have what it takes to support this population? Because in the same way that you make the, example of not wanting to go into teaching, we as therapists, we should, and I'm really kind of putting this out there so that those that are watching this know that if they're seeking therapy from someone, it's okay to ask this question to the therapist. Like, why did you choose this? Do you feel like you can ask it outright? Don't pussyfoot around it. Don't dance around it and feel like you owe them something because they're seemingly the authority in this role, and that you somehow just need to go in there and, work with that. No, because unfortunately, there can be harm there for people because the other piece of it is, as sometimes people will use that term like as a protector, as a police officer, we're the protectors of the community. And so they'll want to come in, and they'll want to try and protect me from and shield me from what they've experienced. Well, okay, but this is about you. So if the clinician isn't strong and trained and doesn't have consultation and supervision and understand the nuanced care, then it's not going to be effective. And unfortunately, it takes a lot for them. I mentioned stigma. It takes a lot for them to reach out and make that appointment. And then lo and behold, they have 1 or 2 sessions with someone and they're like, this person, they can't hold the space for me that I need. And they disband. And then consequently, they don't get the assistance that they really deserve. So that's a fair question on this side, the clinical side as well. Having clinicians or asking them, do you have what it takes? And what it takes is sometimes and I guess I won't get too much into that. We talked a little bit about it last time we talked, just in terms of the type of therapy that I do, because we don't get into the specific details of certain events. That's not necessary for the type of trauma therapy that I do, in order to renegotiate any possible trauma or stuckness that's held in the body as a result of someone who may be going into the profession that maybe didn't ask themselves that question and finds themselves in a high stress, high consequence situation and has shot their bullet and misfired, or, whatever the outcome might be. There's going to be a psychological, emotional effect. And that's what you kind of touched on, and what I grabbed from that video that we're talking about. Yeah.
And also too, not just to dwell on mistakes or situations that we've experienced or lived through. Some of those experiences are positive. Like there's one gentleman it's fresh in my mind because it recently happened. A gentleman that I had an opportunity to provide some training for not too long ago. Responded to a high-risk warrant as a tactical police officer, and he took the life of somebody who literally minutes before they arrived was shooting innocent people. And he did his job, and he did his job really well. And I think that's worthwhile mentioning. I'm not going to name his name, but he's a beauty of a human being. And I think that action that he took that day and he did his job needs to be celebrated. And when I mean that, I don't mean like, high fives and backslaps out of boys. I mean, you did your job, you did it well, and you should be proud of it. Now, the caveat to that, and this is where I'll reach to you to get your professional opinion, there is an element of residue that Dr. Preston Klein uses as a terminology that will remain with that officer for the remainder of his life. And, the way Dr. Preston Klein, he kind of explains residue the way I understand it is residue is exactly what it sounds like. It's something that's left behind from an experience. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Well, in this case, I believe this officer did exactly what we would expect and hope for, and he performed extremely well, and he needs to be celebrated. The residue of which that he will carry into the future, I believe, he should talk about it, and he should reach out to people like you and say, it's okay. It's okay. You're going to feel certain things. And as a professional like yourself, Julie, you could say, expect this, or, be prepared for this in the future. These are some things that may come over you. And then now he's armed with expectations, or at least he's armed with some knowledge and tools to help him navigate those waters when he does find himself there.
Yeah. Because the ultimate consequence of not doing that is we all have an autonomic nervous system that would have been actively at play in that scenario and in all the scenarios involving, high risk, high stress, right? It's how our bodies are designed in the most dramatic sense to keep us alive. The autonomic nervous system is there to activate the fight, flight, or freeze response to basically keep us alive. And so a lot of the training that you all do is to override those instinctual, physiological responses that come up. But what can happen is it can numb out in terms of like the personal and the downtime or the accumulation of many of the things, including even in training, right? There's a level of intensity even in the training. And so, what we don't want is someone, if I just kind of tack on to what you were saying, to not have some sort of notion about what to look out for, what to watch for, what to kind of maybe be a little bit more gentler with yourself in terms of, and this is hard too, right? Because you don't want to take time off work because people don't take time off work and, they push through and all that sort of thing. But to recognize, the term we use is when you're overriding. So maybe you're really dragging, like the time change just happened. So I was like dragging my feet for 3 days. Well, I know that happens every time the time changes. So guess what? It's on me to make sure, I'm making sure I get to bed a bit earlier for a couple days, maybe before, after, whatever. In the same way that individual, if they have information, they can be more sensitive to, which I use that word lightly because that's not something that it could be like considered fluff, right? But be more sensitive to the fact that he's a human being. We're human beings first, and we show up to do what we're called to do. And the residue is the ability to have it land in the way that it brings your nervous system back to more regulation. There's a lot of capacity there for a lot of the individuals that I work with for that to happen really quickly, but it's in due time when they're not taking care of themselves, they're not talking, they're maybe maladapting towards drinking or some sort of like gambling or high risk activities that really are unhealthy for them. It then has the ability to overwhelm their nervous system. And again, in the most dramatic sense, to not even be able to get out of bed or to have massive, like intruding, ruminating thoughts about not being here anymore. And so nobody wants that for anybody. That is not a place we want to see anybody get to. And I say that lightly because there's such a like, ooh, because again, if we were to ask all the people in the room, they know of someone that has ultimately taken their lives or are struggling with, you know, no quality of life because they can't function. They can't even take a shower. So yeah, I don't know if that really touched on what you were saying.
No, it certainly did. And yes, I get it. You know, a lot of the guys that I've had exposure to, they're hard charging, go-getters, highly motivated, highly intelligent, aggressive. And that's what we want. We want to embrace that, and we need it. Our society needs those men. And I say men, not that women cannot do it, but I say men, because when we think of that type of individual who is going to take charge and who is really going to come across to some people as over aggressive, sometimes that's exactly what we need. And the reason I say men is because the majority of who I'm exposed to are men. And I'm not saying that women don't have the capability. That's not my point at all. But what I would say is, given the fact that a lot of these hard charging men that I've exposure to, you use the word sensitive in any context, and they may start to shut off. Where a word that I try to use is acceptance. Like, hey man, accept the fact that it's okay not to be okay. Or the other side of it is, it's okay to feel good about doing your job. And I'm proud of you, you know? So, you know, it's okay. It's accepting. If you're not, if you're starting to feel or hear those voices in your head, it's okay to recognize it and then talk to a professional like yourself. That's okay. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You know? Yeah.
And then someone like you kind of normalizing that it's okay for them is really helpful to be able to, and even again, just bringing it back to the video, for you to name it in that moment, you know, when the charge is there, that this is really impactful. There's, again, a humbling experience that you can bring into the conversation that momentarily, if that's all it is, at least, you know, we hope something lands there in terms of, you know, a message or planting a seed, and it is what it is, and onwards they go. And it's, you know, it's always a work in progress. The conversations are really important. I think for me, there's that, I do work on the extreme end of things, in that the vulnerability that, and, you know, as I say this, I'm even feeling like I want to pull back a little bit, because like you said, if using that word sensitive, they're going to like shut down. I know that, but I'm here to tell you that your comrades that still have a vitality in them that maybe looks like the size of a pinprick, because they want to live, but they can't, because everything else around them has been lost and their whole entire nervous system has shut down. The vulnerability in which they show up for a session for me is to be commended, because there is a vitality there that they want to live, but it's so much on the extreme because they didn't reach out, because they didn't talk to somebody. Maybe they didn't have access to. I mean, a lot of people, especially in OPP, RCMP, work in northern communities, that they're the be all end all. That's all they have is them to do all the things. And they're not going to want to be seen walking into a therapist's office. It's a real problem. So I think for me, that's where the sensitive comes in, because I see it and they don't want to be there. They judge themselves, Randy, themselves, like they don't want to be there. They feel weak. They know that they're being judged. They're judging themselves. It's not comfortable. Yeah.
No, and I can speak from experience. I remember one specific time at my previous place of employment, we had psychologists that we could speak to, and they were on the camp, and they had a house, basically like a section, a location that we could go to. And I remember one time going in to talk to them, and before I made entry into their space, I remember looking over my shoulder a couple of times to see if anybody saw me going in there. And there was an element of embarrassment or insecurity, maybe is probably an accurate word. Like, I felt like, I hope nobody sees me going in here, because everybody knows what this space is. And it wasn't until just recently, maybe a year, 2 years ago, I was thinking back at that moment, and I thought, oh man, if we could find a way just to normalize that, where it's okay to walk in there and have a 10-minute conversation with somebody, and that's their profession. That's what they're there for, and it's okay. And I think a way that we can normalize it is much like in the military, we have annual testing, evaluations, right? So a shooting test, you got to pass. A fitness test, you got to pass. Well, if we were to make this mandatory, where you've got to go talk to, the psychologist, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, then it would become normal. It's like, yeah, I'm just going to check in, make sure that I am where I need to be, or maybe get a little bit of coaching or mentorship or, guidance in any capacity. This is a good thing, because I do believe there are a lot of guys that I used to have the great pleasure to work with who are dealing with something, whether it's operational tempo, training tempo, friction at home, friction at work that goes home, friction at home that goes to work, whatever that might be. We're all dealing with something. And we want to keep those guys performing optimally and healthy, but also remember, we got to keep things into perspective, where I think we chose this life. No one put a gun to our head and said, we have to choose this life, this profession. We chose it. And with acceptance, we chose it. So we're accepting the fact that sometimes we're going to be into a bit of a speed wobble, but that's okay. There are people that can help right our speed wobble. And, it's important that we as professionals look at that seriously, just like we look at shooting seriously, or just like we look at, our annual fitness seriously.
It, sometimes people hear themselves say certain things out loud, and they can figure it out themselves. They just have a listening ear that's there and supporting them, and they feel like they're not being judged around and about it. And just often one of the things I'll ask people is, notice if there's any takeaways from our session today. And I say, there doesn't have to be. And people will say things like, it just feels less heavy. And imagine going in and talking to somebody and walking out less heavy from a burden that you carry. Like, isn't that worth its weight? Just as a bit of a selling, push or whatever. Something, I'll just change gears a little bit. I want to remember to get back to this because you asked it last time. We were talking about how I had been watching or hearing or listening to a podcast where someone was talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And the individual that was commentating or facilitating the podcast did disclose that they had had a diagnosis of PTSD. And they also said, and this was speaking to a law enforcement community, that something to the extent that you never get over that. And I was cringing. I was like, what? This is what they think, that they're never going to get over a diagnosis of PTSD? And then you asked me something around, I think it was like around victim mentality or something around that sort of thing. Do you remember us talking about that?
I do. And it's exactly what it was. I totally disagree. And I don't have a degree on the wall that supports my backing, but I totally disagree. I look at PTSI, as it's referred to now, I guess, as an injury, just like a common cold. You can and you will recover from it, and you will get back in the fight, and you will be probably stronger than you were if you want to, you want to. Yes. And that's what I was referring to with being a victim. Like, I've had great conversations with guys who have left my previous place of employment, and they're bitter. And they're bitter, and they're hanging on to stuff, and they are dealing with it, maybe not in the most optimal way. And when I hear the words that they choose, and I hear the conversations coming out of their mouth, I cannot help but say, you sound like you're creating a victimized approach to what you're dealing with. It's not the unit's fault that you feel this way. Yes, some of this was directly correlated and connected with what you did at the unit. However, it's up to us to let that go, accept who we are, accept what we did, accept, what the future holds. Therefore, we can get back onto the road to a healing, more optimal, healthy quality of life.
Yeah. And so, the PTSD, I'll just go back to that. That's the terminology they use from the Diagnostical and Statistic Manual. And I appreciate the fact that it's very stigmatizing that disorder piece, right? Which is where the I comes in, the injury piece, I think is kind of the premise behind the switch up there, right? And so there's kind of, I think I said in response last time when we talked about this, that someone who might be presenting, or you or someone else observing someone to be sort of in that victim, like blame, resentment, all of that stuff, that's that heaviness that I'm talking about that comes into the room, that unless you're really working it through with someone professionally around and about that, but also recognizing that there is the you is the common denominator, the individual. And so there's that choice, and you use the word acceptance of, XYZ, that together, sussing that out so that you can understand how to get back to you as you know yourself to be. There was a you that before you were on the unit, there was a you that had joy, that had access to pleasure, that had access to love and nurturing and whatever things you enjoyed and had you feel wholesomely you. So yes, there is that in your life. That's what I do is like, talk to me about the familiarity of those times and what is happening in your life now that allows you access to that. And then some people might say nothing. Well, Randy, we bring it right back down to basics. Like I have conversations with people and you're going to laugh, but I'm like, so did you make yourself a coffee this morning? Yeah. Okay. Do you have a favorite mug? Do you know my people? Everybody has a favorite mug. Like everybody has the way that it sits in their mouth. You're laughing because you have one too. Right. And so this is the kind of thing that I do to be able to help people recognize and begin to sort of orient towards like what is working in their lives, because the burden that they carry based on their profession, based on their professional experiences, you touched on relationship, all of those things, that's a burden that they carry that, again, from a nervous system perspective, and this is my specialized trauma training coming in here, from a nervous system perspective, there's still all this activation in their nervous system, the survival instinct that they're not down yet in terms, they haven't down regulated yet towards that homeostasis, that point at which the body is more regulated and, internal systems are working efficiently and they feel ease in their lives. And that's a good indicator that there is more conversation to be had around doing some like, whatever you want to call it, healing work, recovery work, personal growth work. You could have a different name for it. I don't even give a shit. Just like whatever brings you into the space to talk to somebody, because guess what? We're human first. We're human first. Yep. And so sometimes it may feel harsh, but I'll sort of say, congratulations, you're human. Like this really sucks. It really sucks. There's this resentment that you have, this workplace that there's such a thing as sanctuary trauma. There's all of this stuff that we carry. But what's working for you now, and what is something that you want to try and get back to from the past and be able to tap into and attune to moving forward?
Yeah. 100%. I think, when I'll use myself for an example. And if this resonates with a few viewers, great. If it doesn't, that's okay. Like I pride myself on being a warrior, and a warrior is, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually connected. And if I feel off, self introspection, being honest with oneself, I will know when I'm slightly off, whether I'm physically depleted or emotionally depleted. I know because of the way that I interact with people. And to me, that's a red flag. Nothing to be alarmed about, but it's a red flag. It's a recognized ability to then downregulate. Why am I feeling this way? I recognize it as a holistic warrior. I need to be physically capable, need to be emotionally present. I need to be spiritually cognitive of what is going on around me. And collectively, these all are interchangeable. So if something is off, it's okay. It's just up to me to do something about it. Nobody's going to fix my problem, right? But I need to be aware, self-aware enough to know where I want to be and where I am right now. And only I can make those changes.
Yeah. And I'll often use like a scale like of 1 to 10. And I'll ask people like, what's your baseline today? With 10 being, feeling the most off or feeling the most angry, whatever it is, that general theme that they're coming in about, like the most depressed, like, whereas 1 would be the opposite of whatever 10 is. And so I help people to recognize, like, what is your baseline day to day, for right now and maybe in the last month. And so, maybe they'll say like, I'm at a 6 or a 7 for anger, just generally, nothing's pissing me off. I'm just already sitting at that. So, okay, recognizing that you're there. So would you notice if you went from, like, say you were a baseline as a 7, would you notice when you're a 7.1, or does it take till you're a 10 or beyond before you notice, right, that you're ready to blow a gasket? And so often when they're first starting with me, it's that, oh no, I can go from like 0 to 10 in half a second. Well, that is where the ongoing work is. Everything you just described, Randy, is where the ongoing work is. And for some people, and I'll explain that more in a second, but for everybody, I say we are a work in progress till the day we die. So we need to be self-aware and constantly checking in with ourselves so that we understand, okay, if there's a spectrum from 1 to 10 and I'm at a baseline of 7 for anger, I'm going to be reaching that 10 rather quickly compared to if I was at a 2. So how do I get to a 2? What can I lean into in my life in terms of joy? Just pet, how many pets I did therapy with this week on virtual? So many cats, right? Just petting a cat or a dog, or going for a walk with a dog, walking, in nature by yourself and just being in the elements of that. So really paying attention to what are the things that you can gravitate and get joy from. And so, and also recognizing internally what that feels like. What is the felt physiological sense in your body? Okay, so it means I'm less tense, I'm less constricted, in my body. Notice how I just moved my shoulders when I did that, right? And also like my heart is a little bit slower. Maybe I'm not sweating as much. Whatever it shows up as for you, it's going to be different when you're orienting into those more regulating activities. And then, like you said, you're going to be aware that radar is on when you're off by even half a point. And then that allows you to intervene quicker. And that right there is exactly what I say to people when I can get them to that place. Because sometimes it takes me 2 years to stabilize someone to actually get to a place where they can start to recognize. I had someone recently say to me, and I was doing my super proud therapist dance internally, because they said, and it was so organic how it came in, and it was a female officer, and she said, I couldn't hear you before. And she couldn't hear me before because her rational thinking brain was offline, because it was all about activated survival instinct in everything that she did. It wasn't just at the workplace anymore. So this is the kind of thing that how do we expect anybody to understand if they're deviating by a different, a point, to be able to activate something that's positive for them to downregulate if they're constantly in the survival instinct place, right? So that's where the stabilization comes in and the initial work. But so once we can get someone to that place where they're recognizing, okay, and maybe it's just that maybe they don't know why they're off. But like I said earlier, the time change happens. So that was out of my control, but I can do things to kind of plan and put that in place.
There are, as you know, there are intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors. The things that we can control, let's do the best that we can to manage those. Things that are outside of our control, we're going to be thrown with curveballs left, right, and center. I would say one thing to consider for people is, I believe in tribalism. I believe in people that are around you do have an influence. And if you allow somebody into your tribe, they better have some positive intentions. And if they are always coming at you with, you can't do this because of that, you shouldn't do that because of this, guess what? They are not filling your cup, right? So if we had 2 cups here, and as part of a tribe, sometimes I'm going to fill your cup because you need something, whatever that is. But if we're constantly giving, at some point there's going to be nothing left. So when we allow people into our world, it needs to be reciprocated, where, sometimes I give, sometimes I take. And because I'm a human and I accept the fact that none of us are perfect, we're going to make mistakes. We're sometimes going to say things that are maybe not appropriate or not context driven. That's okay. But if this becomes a repetitive habit, we need to do something about that. Right? If it's a once off, that happens. But if it's continuously happening, that's a behavior that can be rectified and can be solidified. And in some cases, we just need to be firm and okay with the fact that you're cutting somebody out of your life because they are doing nothing good for you.
Right. Yeah. And then I could go down a big tangent of like, you know, familial obligations and traditions and, oh, like, you know, I can't do that because it's so-and-so. And I sort of, you know, let's evaluate that. Let's understand that a little bit more. And so that gets more into the depths of like deeper work that sometimes people want to do and they don't want to do. And that's the other thing I'll say. You are, as someone who comes to see someone like me, you're always in the driver's seat. It's always about the person, the client. It's never about me. And so you always have the say in which direction or which way you want to go. I mean, sometimes there's an entanglement if they're coming through like workers' comp, like WSIB, because they tend to hold the purse strings, if you will. Or, you know, like a VAC rehab program or something like that. There's reports that we have to do. So there's like some oversight there. But there's always like collaboration, conversation. Even at that, when reports have to be written for people for those agencies, the clinician that you're working with should be reviewing those reports with you before they're submitted to anybody else. That is not a conversation anybody should be having outside of, you know, the therapeutic relationship about you. You need to have a say in that essentially and see and make sure it's being reflective.
I agree with you 100%. And I've seen some turmoil become caused when an individual is the subject or the topic of discussion, but there's emails or phone calls happening at the periphery, but that individual is not involved. And I always found that
it's not okay.
No, I found that wrong and unprofessional. It's like, hey, we're going to have a conversation about this person. Either get them in the room or at least, you know, CC them on the email, because how are we going to build any trust if people don't know what's being said behind their back? And if we are going to say something behind somebody's back, we better have the respect to that individual to say it to their face. And if we cannot do that, then that needs to be addressed, in my opinion. But
absolutely. No. And I'm sitting here telling you as a professional, that's a minimum standard. And absolutely, that person is the process, right? It's about them and it always has to be about them. And so I just want to normalize those pieces, those little tidbits that I threw in, because I think unless people know, they don't know. And there's this idea of, you know, this entity, if you will, that is somehow having, you know, and, you know, to a certain extent, some of the employers, they do have that final say in certain things, like when they give an order, for example, like there's a whole process and protocol associated to that. Therapy is essentially, it's a collaborative effort, and it's always about the best interests of the client. And for us, it's do no harm. And so how can we do no harm if they're not part of a process and having a say in what's going on? And it needs to be collaborative, and it should be. And if it isn't, then maybe that's not the right therapy partner for you, right? Yeah. That's a good point. Not everybody's a good fit for everybody else, you know. And I guess with that, Julie, question for you, and not to put you on the spot, because I don't even know if you would have an answer. You know, given everything that's going on in the news, and we're hearing about. And I certainly don't want to make this about gun violence, but, you know, with my line of work, this is something that is very important to me. And yes, there's been a spike in gun violence over the last couple of years. And I believe there is a emotionally disturbed person or a mentally unstable person who happens to have access to a firearm. And I believe media is doing a good job of creating a gun violence issue, but I truly believe, to the core of my being, we have a mental health issue that's being blanketed with gun violence. Now, the reason I mention that, and I'm going to bring this to a very specific point. Guns are not the issue. It's people that are mentally unstable or emotionally disturbed. They are the issue. Now, if somebody is in troublesome times, and there's only one of you, for an example, I mean, it would be great if we had 1,000 Julies providing this service, but it's not always that accessible. What can somebody do that realizes or recognizes that they are in an unstable state, and if they can get ahead of it before something catastrophic happens? Is there a piece of advice that you could give? And I know that's very, very like broad spectrum. If you can, like what can we do to help folks? Like, hey, you know,
settle down, take a breath. Let's think about this, because there are some serious consequences that are associated with that.
Yeah. And it's there, there's a bunch of things that come to mind, and one of the main things is present yourself to your nearest hospital and, and mention, this is where I'm at, this is where my headspace is at. There is some difficulty around that, for some first responders, because these are potentially colleagues of theirs, right? So they don't want to show up. And so then that creates a barrier. Embarrassment is one of them as well. There are crisis lines. There is also something that you touched on, which is the tribalism, right? Like making sure that you have, and you touched very clearly on making sure that, you have that reciprocated relationship, because ultimately, I've worked with an individual once where he was so dysregulated that he couldn't even remember where he drove from. But he was in a community where he could remember a colleague friend of his that he ended up showing up at their house. And so they knew right away what to do, because they could see the state that he was in. So, sometimes it's those things. But again, if he didn't have that person in his tribe, in his community, that wouldn't have been available to him. So, I give you those kind of classic answers, like present to, hospital or call a crisis line. But I think first and foremost, two things. One, making sure you are surrounding yourself with healthy relationships, good, solid people that you feel like you can trust. And also, don't reach out to a therapist just when something's wrong or when there's challenges. Like, it's okay to have, I have people that I've been doing this for a while now. So maybe I haven't talked to them in 4 years, and then they just call me up because I'm still here and I'm still doing this. That's not the case all the time with someone that maybe you'd worked with in the past. But, think of the idea of having someone there just to maybe initially meet and gain some trust and feel like they are in it for you and can support you. And then they're there and available for you at times of duress. It's interesting too, because, and I'll just touch on your other comment about gun violence and mental instability. There's a lack of support out there all around, and funding towards support. We also know that there's an issue with substance use in a lot of places, and that's a big piece of it. There was that situation in Saskatchewan when there was the mass murder that didn't involve guns, it involved knives. And so, to your point about mental instability, and I hear those cases, and as a trained mental health clinician, I go there because it's not normal for people to just pick up a weapon and kill somebody. Not to mention, there's a very big difference, from what I'm told, between stabbing and shooting. I obviously don't know what it feels like, but there's going to be a difference in how that's going to feel, right, in your hand, and how that happens. So something's got to be off, because we're not hardwired to be responding, behaving, acting in those ways. So something has gone awry at some point, Could it be in the most recent past? Could it be developmentally and growing up? Could it be, we know now through epigenetic research, and this is where, the longevity of, what's the word I'm looking for? It begins with an I, intergenerational trauma, right? We know through epigenetic research that trauma is held in the body at the cellular level. So it could be something that has happened again in Indigenous communities. Look at the historical stuff, right, with residential schools. So it's difficult to answer the question, because at the same time, for someone to hear me saying this and then go and do that and maybe not get the support that they expected to get. And I really want to name that, just because our system as a whole is faulty. And so I don't want to set someone up. I don't want to say that the support won't be there, but I don't want to say that absolutely, it is there. But that's where I think surrounding yourself with, even someone like yourself, just for your ability to, speak candidly with me today, talk about the things that are important to you that help you stay regulated and a productive member of society, you're going to gain that respect, and therefore be able to, stand in a leadership role to have people hear that and really take with it what they can to start to apply it to their lives. And that's where that, doing our own work is so incredibly important, so that we can recognize when we're feeling a bit off. It really circles right back to that piece again. The hurt and the wounds are out there. So I don't know if this is going to get solved anytime soon. Like, it's humans kind of being imperfect, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I don't think there's going to be that,
a solution.
That's it. There's the gold nugget that's going to fix all problems. No, not at all. But if we can mitigate, minimize, and give a percentage of those people who are hurting, give them something to get back on track. That's a good thing, right?
Yeah. And I know, just because I'm in Ottawa, there's OPS, Ottawa Police Service. They have their wellness. Actually, next Friday, the 17th, they're having a First Responder Day. They've invited clinicians in the community like myself to go in, and they'll have peer supporters for each fire, paramedic, and police, speaking to those of us about, again, the nuanced care of working with that population. So they have a wellness center, and the officers that I work with feel really supported by that wellness center and the work that they do. As far as like military, there is Veterans Affairs, and then there's DND, the programs through National Defense, that they're constantly trying to recruit individuals like myself to be available for. There's different pathways to get access to all of these depending on where they're at. I'll say that it can feel a little bit complicated at times. Then just circling back to Ontario Provincial Police, there is the Encompass with one S, Encompass Wellness, that you can reach out to and speak with a case manager. And there was, so there is also in Ottawa, there is the Ottawa, I think it's called First Responder Association. It's a nonprofit for first responders in the city of Ottawa. And it, maybe there's other similar services in different communities that can provide access to care, and take away the barrier of.
There's definitely some outlets for sure. Like there are people out there that are like yourself. They want to help and they're willing to help. We just have to make that call. And I think if somebody's in a speed wobble and they're having some dark thoughts, reach out to someone within your tribe, someone you trust, and at least start the conversation. That will get you, at least point in the right direction. This is great. I really appreciate it, Julie. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah. Let's do it again.
I could stay here and
I know.
But I do have a client coming in a few minutes. So
as do I. So yeah. Okay. We'll do it again, Randy. Take good care. It was nice chatting with you.
Thanks, Julie. We'll chat soon.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.